In the spring of 1873, a federal marshal riding alone through the Choctaw Nation came upon the 17 bodies, laid out in a perfect ring around a dying campfire. Each man had been shot once between the eyes, and each clutched in his cold hand a single playing card from the same deck. The marshal counted the cards twice before the meaning finally dawned on him. The dead were Pinkerton agents, Texas Rangers, bounty hunters, and 3 deputies from his own office in Fort Smith, Arkansas. They had ridden out together 6 weeks earlier with one mission: to capture or kill the man the papers had begun calling the Black Devil of the Red River. They had failed like every posse before them, and the cards in their hands spelled a message in a code the marshal recognized but could not read. A code that would remain unsolved for another 41 years, long after every soul who knew its meaning lay dead and buried in unmarked graves scattered across 3 states and the Indian Territory. What the marshal didn't know, what no white lawman would grasp for decades, was that the man they hunted had once been property, sold at auction in Natchez, Mississippi, for $940 to a cotton planter who branded him on the left shoulder with the initials J.W., before sending him to the fields at age 11. Before we go further into the story of Jeremiah Walker and the gang that nearly broke the U.S. government in the years after the Civil War, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments which state you're listening from tonight. Because what you're about to hear was buried in classified federal records for over a century, and the descendants of the men involved are still alive in towns from Oklahoma to East Texas. They never wanted this story told. Tonight, we're telling it anyway. To understand how a former slave came to command the most feared outlaw band in frontier history, you have to understand the country that made him. A country that had just torn itself apart over whether men like him were human or property. The war ended in April 1865, but along the western edge of the former Confederacy, in the borderlands where Texas met Indian Territory and Indian Territory met Arkansas, the war never really ended. It just changed form. The Union Army pulled most of its troops back to occupy the deeper South, leaving behind a vast, lawless region nearly the size of France, with fewer than 200 federal lawmen to police it. Into that vacuum poured every desperate soul the war had created: Confederate guerrillas who wouldn't surrender, Union deserters wanted for murder in 3 states, Comanche and Kiowa raiders pushed off their hunting grounds, Mexican vaqueros displaced by new Anglo cattle barons, Chinese laborers who'd finished the railroads and found themselves friendless in a country that hated them, and tens of thousands of freedmen with nowhere to go and nothing to their names, walking west in the clothes on their backs because the South they'd known had become a slaughterhouse for any black man caught alone after dark. The town of Boggy Depot sat at the center of this chaos in the Choctaw Nation, about 40 miles north of the Red River. In the autumn of 1866, it was the kind of place where a man could buy a meal, a horse, or another man's life for roughly the same price. The streets were unpaved, the buildings thrown together from green cottonwood that warped and split as it dried, giving every door and window a crooked look, as if the town itself had been built by a drunk who couldn't remember how houses were supposed to fit together. There were 3 saloons, 2 owned by a Choctaw merchant named Pushmataha Folsom, descendant of a famous chief who'd grown rich selling whiskey to soldiers during the war and saw no reason to stop selling to outlaws. Now that the soldiers had gone home, there was a single store run by a Scottish trader named Angus McRae, who kept a loaded shotgun under the counter and a Bible on top, and was known to settle disputes with whichever he found closer to hand. There was a livery stable, a blacksmith, and a small adobe building that served as both jail and courthouse for whatever rough justice the Choctaw Lithersmen could administer when they bothered to ride through, which was less and less often as the country fell deeper into disorder. Boggy Depot that autumn was less a town than a wound that had begun to scar without healing underneath. Wagons rolled in at all hours from the south, from Texas, carrying men who wouldn't give their names and goods no one asked the provenance of. Wagons rolled out toward the north, toward Fort Smith, carrying things that had once belonged to other people. The graveyard at the edge of town, on a rise behind the Methodist mission abandoned since 1863, had grown by 47 new graves in the 18 months since the war ended, and only 9 of them belonged to people who died of natural causes. The rest had died, as the saying went in that country, of lead poisoning or rope fever, or the kind of accident involving a knife and a back and a moonless night. The Choctaw Light Horsemen, a small body of mounted lawmen authorized by treaty to keep order in the nation, had ridden through twice in the year before. Both times, after killings serious enough to embarrass the tribal government in Tuscaloosa, they'd questioned a few witnesses, found nothing, and ridden away, leaving Boggy Depot to settle its own accounts in its own way. The mission building still stood at the western edge of town, its roof half collapsed, heavy oak doors hanging open. Inside, the children of the town and of passing strangers played among broken pews and smashed pulpits, occasionally finding a torn page of hymn or a fragment of colored window someone had thought worth shooting at. The smell of the town was distinctive. Horse manure, wood smoke, unwashed wool, cheap whiskey, and beneath it all, a faint but persistent scent of old blood soaked into the earth of certain alleys. Rain could not wash it away. Into this town, on a cold November morning in 1866, walked a black man of about 26'2", lean as a coyote, wearing a Union Army cavalry coat, with the chevrons of a corporal still stitched to the sleeve, and a wide, brimmed slouch hat pulled low over eyes the color of wet slate. He carried a Spencer repeating carbine, slung across his back, 2 Colt Army revolvers at his hips and a cross, draw rig he'd cut from harness leather, and a Bowie knife in his right boot. He had no horse. He'd walked the last 60 miles from the Texas border through country, where a black man traveling alone was fair game for anyone who wanted his weapons or his life. He hadn't been bothered. The reasons would become clear to the people of Boggy Depot in the months ahead. His name, he told Angus McRae when he came into the store to buy salt pork and coffee, was Jeremiah Walker. He'd served 3 years in the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, fought at Honey Springs, been wounded twice, and been mustered out at Fort Leavenworth in 1865 with a discharge paper, a back pay voucher the Army refused to honor, and the brand of his former owner still legible on his left shoulder. McRae looked him over once, saw the way Walker stood with his back to the corner, and his eyes on the door, recognized the look of a man who'd long ago decided he'd never be taken alive, and counted out the goods without comment. He even threw in a small bag of dried apples. Years later, when McRae was old and most of the people in this story were dead, he told a journalist from St. Louis that he'd known from the moment Walker walked into his store that the country was about to change, though he had no way of guessing how much. The pieces of Walker's early life, recovered mostly through the patient work of black historians at Howard University in the 1930s and 40s, paint a picture of a childhood designed to break a human being, and somehow producing, through some combination of accident and ferocious will, the opposite. He was born in 1846 on a cotton plantation in Adams County, Mississippi, the property of a planter named Josiah Whittington, who owned roughly 200 enslaved people and ran his operation on what he called scientific principles, meaning he'd read agricultural journals and concluded productivity could be maximized by breaking slave families apart and selling children when they reached working age. On the theory that workers without family attachments were less likely to escape and more focused on their tasks. Walker's mother, whose name in the plantation ledgers was only Hannah, had been sold south to Louisiana when Jeremiah was 9. He never saw her again. His father, whose identity Walker never knew with certainty, was probably a free blacksmith from Natchez who'd been allowed brief visits under tightly controlled conditions and disappeared from local records in 1853. Possibly murdered. Possibly fled. At 11, Walker was sold to a cotton planter in northern Louisiana, the man whose initials would be burned into his shoulder, who treated him with casual brutality that, by the standards of the time, was neither unusual nor noteworthy. Walker escaped at 15 in 1861. During the chaos of the early war, making his way north through Mississippi swamps to Union lines. He was eventually directed to a recruiting station in Kansas, enlisting black soldiers for what would become the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. He served with distinction for 3 years. He learned to read in the regimental school, taught by a Quaker chaplain from Pennsylvania, who would later remember him in a memoir as the most quietly intelligent young man he'd ever encountered. With a memory that retained convictions that have made him a consistent detective officer. Not permitted any order for us or any army that have obliged men to wear officers' insignia. The Union Army didn't allow that. Walker was discharged a corporal, having been recommended for promotion to sergeant 3 times and denied each time on grounds the regulations of the period prohibited. What happened over the next 18 months in the territory between the Red River and the Canadian River is documented in pieces in the records of the Choctaw Light Horsemen, in dispatches of federal marshals at Fort Smith, in the private correspondence of Texas cattlemen, and in oral histories black families in eastern Oklahoma still tell their children, though now quietly, because the descendants of those who hunted Jeremiah Walker still live in those counties, and old grudges in that country outlive the men who first conceived them. By the spring of 1868, Walker had assembled a band so improbable in its composition that federal authorities at first refused to believe the reports. There were 7 black freedmen, all former Union soldiers like Walker, including a Tennessee man named Cates Pettigrew, who'd been a regimental scout and could read sign on Bear Rock. There were 4 Comanche warriors led by a man called Tabananaka, meaning sound of the sun, who'd lost his entire family to a Texas Ranger raid in 1864 and saw the alliance as a continuation of his war against white settlers by other means. There were 3 Mexican brothers from the Nueces Strip, Ignacio Ramen and Severino Quintanilla, whose father had been hanged by Anglo vigilantes during the so-called Cart War, bringing with them the brutal efficiency of borderland feuds. There were 2 white men, both Confederate guerrillas who'd ridden with William Quantrill and had no place left in the post-war world. A Missourian named Ellis Tatum and a Kentuckian named Calvin H. Horton. There was an old Choctaw freedman named Solomon Beams, who'd been enslaved by a Choctaw planter before the war and now served as cook, scout, and unofficial diplomat with the 5 civilized tribes. And there was a woman, which federal records found particularly hard to accept. A black woman of maybe 25 named Dilja Ransom, who'd escaped a Louisiana plantation at 15 and spent the war years as a laundress for a Union cavalry regiment, learning to handle a pistol with both hands and read maps with the quick instinct of a born tactician. She rode as an equal, planned several of its most successful raids, and, according to the only surviving photograph, was a woman of striking and severe beauty, with high cheekbones and eyes focused on something 100 yards beyond whatever was in front of her. The gang didn't steal cattle, and that's what made them dangerous. Cattle thieves were a known quantity, easily hunted down by cattlemen's associations and stock detective agencies. What Walker's band stole was money, in quantities no frontier outlaw had imagined possible. Their first major operation, in April 1868, was the robbery of a payroll wagon belonging to the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad. Pushing its line west across Indian Territory, the wagon carried a 28 Zalelzend in Union greenbacks for construction crews, guarded by 12 armed men, including 4 Pinkerton agents brought in because the railroad anticipated trouble. The wagon was struck at 3 a.m. by a force survivors estimated at 30 riders, though Walker's entire band never numbered more than 20. The attack was over in less than 4 minutes. 3 guards were killed, 2 of them Pinkertons, and the rest stripped of weapons and tied to trees. The money was loaded onto pack mules and carried east into the Kiamichi Mountains, disappearing into a network of caves the Choctaw freedmen had used as hiding places during the war. None of it was recovered. The surviving guards, when they could make coherent statements at Fort Smith, spoke of an attack that didn't feel like an attack at all. There'd been no shouted demands, no warning shots, just a sudden silence, the kind that drops on a forest when a predator enters, every small animal holding its breath at once. The 2 lead horses pulling the wagon had collapsed simultaneously, killed by 2 perfectly placed rifle shots from more than 300 yards by marksmen they never saw. Then riders emerged from timber on both sides, walking their horses slowly, faces covered in dark cloth, guns held ready but not pointed. The way a man holds a gun when he's so certain of his ability, he sees no need to threaten. 3 guards, including the senior Pinkerton, tried to draw. They were shot dead before their hands completed the movement. By riders no one saw aim. The others raised their hands. They were ordered in a calm voice, later described as sounding like a country school teacher addressing a slow class, to dismount, remove their gun belts, walk to designated trees, and put their wrists together behind trunks. They complied. They were tied with cord cut to exactly the right length in advance. They were searched, but small valuables, watches, rings, personal cash, were left untouched. Only the railroad money, the company money, was taken. One of the guards, a young Pinkerton from Pennsylvania on his first Western assignment, began to cry. One of the masked riders dismounted, walked over, and offered him a sip from a flask of whiskey. The young man accepted. The rider patted his shoulder, returned to his horse, and rode away. By dawn, when a passing freight wagon found them, the guards had been tied for nearly 5 hours. The only thing they could agree on was that the men who attacked them hadn't been ordinary outlaws. They'd been soldiers, the kind who'd survived the war by becoming better at killing than the people trying to kill them, and then, for reasons no one understood, had kept going. What disturbed the Pinkerton Agency more than the money was the discovery that each guard had been tagged with a small paper pinned to his shirt, all saying the same thing in a careful schoolmaster's hand. "We could have killed you. We chose not to. Tell your masters that the next time, the choice will be different." The agency didn't know what to do. It had been founded 20 years earlier by a Scottish abolitionist named Alan Pinkerton, who'd run safe houses on the Underground Railroad, and in younger days might have understood Walker better than any man alive. But by 1868, Pinkerton had become the chief private police force for the railroads and Eastern banking interests, and his field agents were told to treat Walker's band as a simple criminal conspiracy. Bring them in alive if possible, dead if not. The agency assigned its best man, a former Chicago detective named Patrick Donovan, to coordinate the hunt. Donovan was a hard Irish immigrant who'd risen by being smarter and more ruthless than those around him. He understood from the start this wouldn't be an ordinary chase. Arriving at Fort Smith in May 1868, he sat down with the federal marshal there, former Union General James Fagan, and asked one question. How does a man hide 20 riders, 4 of them Comanche, in country where every cattleman, settler, and teamster reports a strange face within a day? Fagan had no answer. Neither did Donovan. The answer, when it emerged 2 years later, shocked the federal government into a level of secrecy that kept the truth from newspapers for the rest of the century. The answer was that Walker wasn't hiding. He was protected by a network of people across 3 states and the Indian Territory who'd decided, each in their own way and for their own reasons, that whatever Walker was doing needed to be done. The first hint came in the summer of 1868, when a Pinkerton informant in the Choctaw town of Dokesville reported that wagons of supplies had been moving in and out of the Kiamichi Mountains for months with the apparent cooperation of the Choctaw Light Horsemen, who were turning a deliberate blind eye. Donovan investigated and found the informant murdered 3 days after his report. His body left in the middle of Main Street with a single playing card pinned to his chest, the King of Spades. No one in Dokesville had seen anything. No one knew anything. When Donovan threatened federal troops, the Choctaw chief, a man named Allen Wright, a graduate of Union College who'd translated the Bible into Choctaw, looked at him with patient contempt and said only that the Choctaw Nation was sovereign under treaties of 1866. Federal troops couldn't enter without consent, and consent wouldn't be given. The implication was clear. Walker had the protection of the Choctaw government, or enough of its officials to make it effective. Donovan returned to Fort Smith and sent a long telegram to Pinkerton headquarters in Chicago. The response from Allen Pinkerton himself, a copy survives in the agency's archives, was one of the strangest documents in American law enforcement history. It instructed Donovan to proceed, but to use particular discretion in any actions that might bring the matter to public attention. Pinkerton, the old abolitionist, seemed to understand something complicated was happening, something that didn't fit neatly into law and crime, and he was reluctant to bring full force down without knowing what he'd destroy. If you're still listening, and I hope you are, take a moment to hit that like button, because the algorithm only shows buried American history to people who actively engage. The families who've spent 150 years trying to keep this story buried have done a very effective job. Every like, comment, and share helps another person discover what really happened in the territory after the Civil War. And if you have a theory about what was really going on in the Kiamichi Mountains, leave it in the comments, because what we're about to discover is that the truth was stranger and darker than even Patrick Donovan was prepared to imagine. In the autumn of 1868, Walker's band struck again, hitting a stagecoach carrying gold from the Choctaw Nation's annuity payment, money the federal government owed under the Treaty of 1866 and had finally agreed to pay in coin rather than depreciated paper, currency the tribes had learned to refuse. The coach carried the 19 Zalozen in gold double eagles, guarded by a detachment of the 6th U.S. Cavalry. The cavalry detachment was wiped out. 8 troopers killed in a single volley from rifles on both sides of the road. And the gold was taken. But this wasn't what made the robbery famous. What made it famous was what Walker did next. Within 2 weeks, every Choctaw freedman family in the eastern half of the nation had received, by means no investigation could trace, a small leather pouch containing exactly 20 LR in gold double eagles. There were nearly 700 such families. The math worked out almost exactly to the amount stolen, with a small remainder the freedmen insisted had been used for school books. Federal investigators found, to their fury, that none of the recipients would say a word about who brought the gold or how it arrived. The pouches simply appeared on doorsteps in the night with no note. When pressed, the freedmen only said the Lord worked in mysterious ways, and looked at the agents with expressions combining politeness, patience, and deep, ancient amusement they couldn't penetrate. Patrick Donovan understood exactly what had happened. Walker wasn't a thief, not even an outlaw in the conventional sense. He was a redistributor, an inverted Robin Hood operating in a post-war landscape, where the federal government had failed its most basic obligations to those it had freed, where railroads and cattle barons seized every acre and dollar they could get before any resistance could form. Walker was the resistance. By spring 1869, the band had carried out at least 11 major operations, including 2 more railroad payroll robberies, looting a Wells Fargo office in Texarkana, intercepting a herd of Texas cattle driven north by speculators who'd cheated Comanche families out of treaty grazing rights, and a daring raid on the Bank of Sherman, Texas, which had foreclosed on dozens of small farms owned by freedmen and Mexican families during the Panic of 1867. The bank's vault was emptied of $41,000 and its records, including foreclosure files, were burned in the street. Within a month, deeds to foreclosed properties began appearing in the mail of dispossessed families, with notarized statements that the bank had reconsidered and was returning the land. The notary stamps were forged, but the deeds were genuine. Someone with extensive legal knowledge had transferred them properly through the county recorder's office, using a clerk bribed, blackmailed, or persuaded to cooperate. Federal authorities tried to challenge the deeds. The court, presided over by a Reconstruction judge sympathetic to freedmen, ruled the transfers legal on their face, and the government had no standing to contest them. The families kept their land. The bank, ruined, closed within 6 months. Patrick Donovan, reading reports in his Fort Smith office, began developing what he later described in a private letter to his wife as a peculiar admiration for his quarry, an admiration he found morally troubling and professionally dangerous. He wrote that he'd begun to understand why Walker had become a folk hero, why songs about him sung by black families in the Cotton Bottoms had spread to cattle camps and railroad crews, why even white settlers, small farmers and Confederate veterans ruined by the war, saw Walker not as an outlaw, but as a man taking back what had been stolen from everyone not rich enough to be on the winning side of the new American economy. Donovan understood all this, and also understood his job wasn't negotiable. In summer 1869, Donovan made his first serious attempt. He assembled 40 men, 20 Pinkerton agents, 12 Texas Rangers under Captain Leander McNelly, and 8 federal marshals from Fort Smith, with New Henry repeating rifles, plenty of ammunition, and the best horses the agency could buy. They had intelligence from an informant, a freedman named Cyrus Burdett, who'd briefly ridden with Walker's band and been turned by a federal pardon and $1,000, that Walker's main camp was in a hidden valley in the Kiamichi Mountains, called by the Choctaw the Valley of the Whispering Pines, accessible only through a narrow defile, kept guarded day and night. Donovan's force rode out June 3, 1869, to rendezvous with Burdett at a crossroads near Tuskahoma, where he'd lead them by a back route into the valley, bypassing the defile. They reached the crossroads at dusk. Burdett was waiting, sitting against a tree, hands tied behind his back, throat cut from ear to ear, eyes still open. Pinned to his shirt was a playing card, the king of spades. Donovan understood instantly. Burdett had been doubled. He'd taken federal money while reporting back to Walker, who'd used him to lure the force into a trap. Donovan ordered his men into defensive perimeter and to prepare for attack. The attack came at moonrise, a three-quarter moon rising late and bright through pine tops. Men who survived would never afterward sit comfortably in a dark forest or hear hooves on pine needles or smell wood smoke on a summer night without feeling the hair on their arms stand up. It came from every direction at once, from positions prepared days in advance, with crossfires pinning the federal force in a small clearing surrounded by dense timber. The first volley killed 6 men in one breath. Men standing or kneeling in positions they thought offered protection, but had been chosen for them by marksmen in the trees, using their defensive instincts to guide them into the kill zone. Return fire was wild. They fired at muzzle flashes seeming everywhere and nowhere, moving between shots, never twice from the same position. Captain McNelly, famously aggressive, tried to charge into timber south of the clearing. He was shot through the neck before 5 steps, dying slowly over 10 minutes while his men crouched behind logs, unable to help without drawing the same fire. A voice, Walker's, or someone speaking for him, called out in clear English to lay down arms and stand with hands empty, and they wouldn't be killed. Donovan, bleeding from a shoulder wound that nearly killed him, made a decision he'd second. Guess forever. He ordered surrender. The fight lasted less than an hour. When it was over, 16 of 40 men were dead, 12 wounded. The rest, including Donovan, stripped of weapons, horses, and uniforms, were left to walk 40 miles back to Fort Smith in their underclothes. None of Walker's band, as far as anyone could tell, had been killed or even wounded. Donovan staggered into Fort Smith 3 days later, sunburned and dehydrated, with a tag pinned to his bare chest, reading the same 5 words as the wagon guards a year before. Federal Marshal Fagan telegraphed Washington, requesting authority to raise regular cavalry, at least a regiment, to clear the territory of what he called, in the language of the time, the Negro Insurrectionary Band, led by the freedman Walker. The War Department's response was a denial. The reasons wouldn't become clear for 50 years when files opened to historians. But the truth the War Department understood was that Walker's operations had become entangled in larger political conflict. Reconstruction policies of the Grant administration, the legal status of freedmen in Western territories, and the desperate efforts of railroads and cattle interests to seize Indian territory before federal authority could be established. Sending a cavalry regiment to hunt a band with Comanche warriors and Choctaw protection could trigger exactly the larger Indian war General Sherman was trying to avoid. It would also, less officially but perhaps more importantly, draw national attention to the catastrophic federal failure to protect freedmen, allowing a de facto slavery through convict lease, black codes, and rising Klan violence the government couldn't or wouldn't suppress. Walker was an embarrassment. Cavalry would make him a martyr. Better to let the Pinkertons handle it quietly, out of public view, hoping the problem would solve itself through attrition of arrests, betrayals, and natural causes. That became Grant's policy. Donovan was instructed to continue with whatever resources the agency could provide and keep it out of newspapers. Donovan, who'd nearly died in the Valley of the Whispering Pines, accepted with grim understanding of the country he served. What followed were 3 years of a strange, slow, secret war, fought in canyons, bottoms, and small towns of Indian Territory, Texas borderlands, and southwestern Arkansas. Walker's band continued hitting selected targets with surgical precision. Never the same place twice, never killing more than necessary, always leaving their cards and tagged messages. They robbed 2 more banks, 3 railroad payrolls, an army quartermaster wagon carrying 60 Zalozan for frontier garrisons, and most spectacularly, in October 1870, attacked and looted a riverboat called the Memphis Belle, tied up at a wood landing on the Arkansas River, taking 90 of Zalozan in cash and bullion for New Orleans cotton factors. In each case, proceeds disappeared into caves, sympathetic farms, and quietly bribed officials across 3 states. In each case, within weeks, freedmen, dispossessed Indians, ruined farmers, and displaced Mexican families received small, unmarked cash packages, returned deeds, or livestock reappearing at their gates. Walker had built a parallel economy, a redistributive system funded by armed expropriation from the largest post, war capital concentrations, operated through a mutual aid network crossing every line of race, religion, and language in the borderlands. Donovan understood all this, and the more he understood, the more he found himself, against his will and orders, beginning to admire the man sent to destroy. He wrote in his journal, discovered in a Chicago attic in 1947 by his granddaughter and deposited at the Newberry Library, that Walker was the most dangerous man in America, not because he killed white people, but because he showed an alternative to the developing American economy was possible, and could be defended by those willing to die for it. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror intensifies. If this story gives you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. The thing that finally broke the band, what no Pinkerton or federal investigation could accomplish, was something no one foresaw. Not betrayal, though there'd been many attempts, not military force, though Donovan kept dispatching posses, but ultimately personal grief and strategic miscalculation, the same combination that's destroyed every armed resistance sooner or later. In spring 1872, Dilja Ransom was pregnant. The father was Jeremiah Walker, intimate since at least 1868, but kept concealed even from the band, because Walker believed attachments made a man vulnerable, and Dilja insisted on operating as equal commander, not wife. The pregnancy changed everything. Walker, who'd survived slavery, war, and 4 years as the most hunted man in the West, confronted something he'd never imagined: a future, a child, a family. Records suggest he and Dilja planned to withdraw from the band, shifting to advisory roles, letting younger men like Kate's Pettigrew and Tabananaka's nephew, a young Comanche named Pahayoko, take leadership. Walker and Dilja would relocate to a small Choctaw Nation farm, quietly purchased in Solomon Beam's name, and try to live ordinary lives. It was a beautiful plan, a sentimental plan, a plan, as Walker probably knew, no man in his position had any right to make. It was discovered by Patrick Donovan in October 1872 through dumb luck, so improbable he attributed it to divine intervention, in which he'd not previously believed. A Choctaw freedman named Ezekiel Folsom, distantly related to Pushmataha Folsom and the chief, arrested in Fort Smith for horse theft, offered information to save himself. He'd heard from a cousin at the Tuskahoma recorder's office that a deed had recently been registered for a farm near Atoka in the name of Solomon Beams. Folsom didn't know who that was or why it mattered, just gossip to buy his freedom. Donovan, across the desk, recognized the name instantly. Seen it in reports for years, mentioned as Walker's associate. The deed was the first concrete connection to identifiable fixed property. A thread. Donovan pulled it. What he found was the whole patterns. The Atoka farm bought with cash deposited in a Sherman, Texas, bank by a freight agent named Augustus Blandon, who'd received the cash from a Choctaw merchant named Cyrus Pitchlynn, brother-in-law of Pushmataha Folsom, the Boggy Depot saloon owner and principal whiskey supplier to the Kiamichi Mountains. By following money, Donovan mapped the entire commercial infrastructure of Walker's network. Every saloon keeper, freight agent, bribed clerk, sympathetic farmer moving supplies and information for 4 years. He didn't move on any, he watched, waited, compiled. By February 1873, he'd listed 147 individuals across 3 states and Indian Territory materially involved, and identified with confidence the Atoka farm, where Walker and Dilja planned to retire after the child's birth, expected late spring. Donovan then did something no Pinkerton agent had done. He went directly to Allen Pinkerton in Chicago, laying out the entire case. What Walker built, what the network was, why freedmen, Indians, Mexicans, and ruined white farmers protected it, and that any attempt to destroy it by force, even with intelligence, would create martyrs and harden it into permanent insurgency the government couldn't suppress without politically impossible violence. He proposed instead to make Walker an offer. The offer, presented through an intermediary in March 1873, Walker and Dilja could keep the Atoka farm, keep their unborn child, receive federal pardons signed by President Grant for all crimes. In exchange, they'd disband, return to private life, and use remaining moral authority to discourage further resistance to the federal government and developing economy. They would, in effect, sell out. The intermediary was Solomon Beams, held in protective custody at Fort Smith for 2 months without charge, treated well, fed at the marshal's table, allowed letters home. Donovan explained with patient clarity what would happen to the entire network, including Beams' own family, if the offer was rejected. Beams understood. He carried the offer into the Kiamichi Mountains, delivering it to Walker personally on a cold March evening. What was said isn't recorded. Beams refused for the rest of his life to discuss it with any white man, and the only people he told fully were 3 black ministers in eastern Oklahoma who died without writing it down. What's known Walker accepted. He understood, as Donovan hoped, that refusal's cost would be paid not by him, but by everyone who'd stood with him. And he had no right to ask them for his own pride or continued resistance. The plan was set for April 7, 1873. Walker would meet Donovan at a remote Texas border cabin to sign formal pardons and begin disbandment. Alone, both unarmed, witnessed by Solomon Beams and Choctaw Judge Allen Wright, the same chief who'd faced Donovan 5 years earlier at Dokesville, now after considerable pressure acting as guarantor of federal good faith. Walker arrived at midnight on April 17, alone on a horse, carrying no weapons. Donovan waited. The pardons were signed. The two shared a bottle of whiskey. The first time, Walker remarked, he'd ever drunk with a white lawman. They talked for hours. The war, the territory, the future. Donovan wrote in his journal that Walker spoke of his unborn child with a softness unexpected from a man who'd killed perhaps 50 others. Walker asked whether the Grant administration would honor the pardon, whether it would hold in court, whether the Atoka land would remain his if a prosecutor challenged it 5 years later. Donovan said honestly he didn't know. He'd done everything in his authority to make it binding. The pardon bore the president's signature. Judge Wright was witness and guarantor. But the U.S. government wasn't in the habit of keeping promises to black men or Indians, and Walker would be a fool to trust any paper from Washington. Walker smiled, a small private smile Donovan remembered for life, and said only he was tired. Tired for 10 years. And decided foolish trust was better than spending his life running, raising his child on the run, watching his child expect to be killed like his father and grandfather. He'd made peace with the possibility the pardon wouldn't hold. If it didn't, at least he'd tried. He was giving up the band for the chance, however small, of a life not defined by the expectation of violence. They parted before dawn. Walker rode north toward the Choctaw Nation and the Atoka farm, where Dilsha waited. Donovan rode east toward Fort Smith with the signed agreement in his saddlebag. What happened next? Donovan hadn't anticipated, nor had any in the federal government. It demonstrated with terrible finality that Walker's network wasn't actually under his control, and perhaps never had been. The 17 men who'd been hunting Walker for 6 weeks. Pinkerton agents, Texas Rangers, federal deputies whose bodies the marshal would later find in their perfect circle around the dying campfire, hadn't known about Donovan's negotiation. They were operating under older orders to capture or kill Walker on sight. They'd been close, picking up his trail 2 days before the cabin meeting, closing in when Walker rode away at dawn. They caught him mid-morning on April 18 in a small ravine about 12 miles south of the Red River in Texas. They surrounded him, demanded surrender. Walker, unarmed as a gesture of good faith, raised his hands and showed the signed federal pardon. The POS leader, Texas Ranger Captain Moriah Hollister, took the pardon, read it, and threw it on the ground. He said he didn't recognize the authority of any pardon from the Grant administration. His orders came from the state of Texas and cattlemen's associations funding his work, and those orders hadn't changed. He gave Walker 30 seconds to draw a weapon and defend himself. Walker still had none. He just stood there. Hollister shot him through the chest from 12 feet. Walker fell. Hollister rode forward, dismounted, and put a second bullet through Walker's head as he lay dying in the dust. Then he ordered the body hanged from the nearest tree as a warning. The POS rode away. They didn't know what they'd done. Didn't know about the network, Dilsha ransom, and her unborn child waiting at Atoka. Didn't know they'd executed the only man holding back something older and more dangerous than any outlaw band. They found out within 48 hours. Kate's Pettigrew was first to reach the body, alerted by a Comanche scout shadowing Walker north from the Donovan meeting. Pettigrew cut it down, buried it in an unmarked grave never discovered. Then he sent runners across the network, carrying no message except a date, a place, and a deck of playing cards with 17 specific cards removed. The remaining band and inner circle understood what was asked. Within 6 weeks, every man who'd been in that POS, including Hollister, was hunted down and killed. Each shot once between the eyes, each left holding one of the 17 missing playing cards, arranged in a pattern meaningless to investigators. But when read in order of death, in a code based on Comanche counting, spelled simple words, "This debt is paid." Patrick Donovan, when he understood, requested leave from Pinkerton. He went to Chicago, spent 3 weeks drinking alone in a hotel, then wrote Alan Pinkerton resigning. He could no longer continue in a profession that used him to lure a man to death under false promise of a federal pardon. Pinkerton refused, explaining that Hollister wasn't under federal orders. His actions were unauthorized and in strict legal sense a state crime. The government couldn't be held responsible. Donovan understood this was true in the narrowest legal sense and false in every meaningful sense. The government had created conditions where Hollister believed his orders unchanged. By failing to communicate the pardon to field operatives, failing to coordinate agencies, fundamentally not wanting Walker to live. He understood Walker was killed not by Hollister, but by a government deciding an alternative American economy couldn't exist. He stayed, nowhere else to go, a family to support, but never worked another case in the territory, never spoke to Pinkerton again except through subordinates. He died in 1907 in Chicago of pneumonia, age 73. His last words, according to his daughter, were the name, Jeremiah, repeated twice. What happened to Dilsha Ransom and the child? The network of 147, the Atoka farm. Answers are in pieces. Family histories, oral traditions of freedmen, Choctaw, Comanche, never fully assembled, probably never will be. Dilsha gave birth to a son in May 1873, named him Jeremiah after his father. She left the Choctaw Nation within a month, traveling to New Orleans, then by ship to Liberia, where a small community of black expatriates from the South had been trying for 50 years to build a free republic on Africa's west coast. She arrived in Monrovia in November 1873, living under the name Dilsha Walker until her death in 1904. Her son grew up in Liberia, educated at the College of West Africa, became a lawyer, returned to the U.S. in the 1910s, and became an early organizer of what became the NAACP. He died in 1949 in Atlanta, having lived a whole life without publicly acknowledging his father. Though in a private letter to his own son, he wrote he'd been told the story at 12 by his mother and carried it every day after. The network of 147 was never prosecuted. Donovan, in his last act of conscience, burned the list in his Chicago hotel fireplace the week after Walker's death. The names existed nowhere else. The men and women lived out their lives in towns and farms. The support they'd given Walker remaining a secret, shared only with children and grandchildren. Late at night, when the white world wasn't listening, the Atoka farm was burned in 1875 by night riders linked to the early Klan, who'd heard rumors it once belonged to Walker and wanted to make a statement. The rumors were unconfirmed. Land sold for taxes in 1878 to a white settler from Kansas, Ebenezer Crowley, who had no idea what he bought. Plowing the south field, he found a small leather pouch buried 6 inches down, containing 20 gold double eagles, the last of the Choctaw annuity gold from the 1868 robbery. Buried by Walker on the farm he hoped to live on, perhaps as insurance or habit. Crowley sold it to a bank in Atoka, bought a team of mules, lived a long, uneventful life on that land, never knowing what he'd found. He died in 1909, having mentioned it to no one but his wife. The story of Jeremiah Walker, runaway slave who built the most dangerous gang the Western Territories had ever seen, was systematically suppressed by the federal government. The Pinkertons' cattle interests, and the dominant narrative of the American West, which had no place for a black man on horseback with a Spencer carbine and a network of 147 across 3 states willing to die to protect him. The story survived in fragments, songs black families in eastern Oklahoma sing, without quite knowing what they mean. Playing cards that occasionally appear in antique markets with strange markings, a small obelisk in a forgotten Choctaw cemetery bearing no name, but decorated every April 18 with a bouquet of prairie flowers placed by unseen hands. After 150 years, belonging to great-grandchildren of those who knew the truth and refused to let it die. This mystery shows us the history we're taught is rarely the history that actually happened. And the most dangerous, men aren't those who kill and steal for personal gain, but those who refuse to accept the world as they find it is the only world that can exist. What do you think? Do you believe everything was revealed? Was Jeremiah Walker an outlaw, a hero, or something more complicated? Leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark mysteries, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next.